You think you know what medieval torture looked like, but here's the thing. The worst executions weren't designed to kill quickly. They were engineered as public entertainment that could last for days. Which method was so popular that crowds would travel hundreds of miles just to witness it? Medieval England had a special way of dealing with traitors. They didn't just kill them, they turned it into the most horrifying show on earth. Hanging, drawing, and quartering wasn't just an execution. It was psychological warfare designed to make sure nobody ever thought about betraying the crown again. Here's how it worked, and trust me, it gets worse as we go. First, they'd drag the condemned through the streets tied to a horse, not riding it, being pulled behind it like a sack of potatoes. The crowds would gather, throwing whatever they could find. Rotten vegetables if they were lucky, rocks if they weren't. Then came the hanging. But here's the twisted part. They didn't let you die. The executioner would cut you down just before you lost consciousness. Why? Because the real show was just getting started. While you're still alive and gasping, they'd slice open your belly and pull out your organs, right there in front of everyone. Children, grandmothers, the local baker, everyone got a front row seat to this medieval horror movie. Finally, they'd hack the body into quarters. 4 pieces, each sent to different parts of the kingdom. Your head usually ended up on a spike somewhere prominent. Nothing says, "Don't mess with the king," quite like your neighbor's head greeting you at the city gates. William Wallace learned this the hard way in 1305. The Scottish rebel thought he could challenge English rule. Instead, he became the most famous victim of this barbaric practice. His execution in London drew massive crowds who watched every gruesome detail. The genius of this method wasn't just the cruelty, it was the theater. Every person who witnessed it went home with nightmares and a very clear message about what happened to traitors. But England wasn't alone in creative brutality. Other parts of Europe had their own signature methods of making death as terrifying as possible. While English crowds were still cleaning blood off the cobblestones from hangings, other parts of Europe had their own twisted specialty. The breaking wheel made English executions look almost merciful by comparison. This contraption was basically a large wooden wheel, kind of like what you'd find on a medieval cart, except way more sinister. The victim got tied to it, arms and legs spread out like they were making a snow angel from hell. Then came the fun part, if you can call systematic bone crushing fun. The executioner would take a heavy iron bar and methodically smash every major bone in the person's body. We're talking arms, legs, ribs, you name it. The whole point was to break them without killing them outright. Takes real skill to shatter someone's skeleton while keeping them breathing. Here's where it gets really twisted. After turning their bones into powder, they'd weave the broken limbs through the wheel spokes like some grotesque human pretzel. Then they'd hoist the whole thing up on a pole for everyone to see. The victim would hang there, still alive, waiting to die from exposure, thirst, or plain old shock. Death could take hours, sometimes days, rain, sun, birds pecking at you. Nature became your final torturer while the whole town watched your slow fade to black. Makes you wonder what these people did for weekend entertainment before Netflix, right? The wheel served double duty as both execution device and permanent billboard. Long after the screaming stopped, that wheel stayed up there as a friendly neighborhood reminder about what happens when you murder, rob, or decide to rebel against the local lord. France and Germany were particularly fond of this method, though it spread through Eastern Europe like a really morbid fashion trend. They used it for serious crimes, murder, highway robbery, that sort of thing. But while the wheel was busy breaking bones in broad daylight, other parts of Europe were perfecting something even more theatrical. If you thought the breaking wheel was brutal, wait until you hear about medieval Europe's favorite method for dealing with heretics and alleged witches. Burning at the stake wasn't just about killing someone, it was about making a religious statement that could be seen for miles. The process started long before anyone struck a match. Authorities would drag the condemned through town, giving crowds plenty of time to gather. Then came the theatrical setup. A wooden post driven into the ground, bundles of kindling stacked high, and church officials ready to perform their holy duties. Makes sense they'd want maximum attendance for their divine justice, right? Joan of Arc became history's most famous victim in 1431. The French teenager who claimed God spoke to her found herself tied to a stake in Rouen marketplace. Thousands watched as flames consumed the girl who'd helped crown a king. But Joan wasn't alone. Thousands of others met the same fate across Europe. The church loved this method because fire supposedly purified the soul. They genuinely believed they were doing victims a favor by burning away their sins. The weird part is how they'd sometimes show mercy by strangling people first so they wouldn't feel the flames. Generous of them. Death by fire isn't quick like you might think. Victims often died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached vital organs, but not always. Sometimes the wind would blow smoke away, leaving people conscious as their bodies cooked. Crowds would hear screaming that lasted far longer than anyone expected. Public burnings became massive social events. Vendors sold food, families brought children, and religious leaders delivered sermons about God's justice. The spectacle served its purpose. Few people wanted to risk challenging church authority after witnessing such horror. These fiery executions dominated European squares for centuries, but they weren't the only honorable way to die. Medieval nobles had their own preferred method of departure, one that promised speed and dignity rather than slow-burning terror. If you were a noble in medieval Europe and found yourself on the wrong side of the law, you'd probably pray for one thing: the axe. Beheading was considered the gentleman's execution, quick, clean, and supposedly honorable. Well, when it went right anyway. The logic was simple enough. Aristocrats had blue blood, so they deserved a blue ribbon death. No messy torture devices or slow roasting over fires, just one swift chop and done. Kings, queens, dukes, and nobles who committed treason or murder could expect this merciful treatment. Makes sense, right? Even in death, social class mattered. England perfected this art form, if you can call it that. The Tower of London became famous for its collection of headless royalty. Anne Boleyn got the premium package in 1536. Henry VIII even imported a skilled French swordsman for the occasion. Talk about going the extra mile. The French guy knew his business too. One clean slice and Anne was history. But here's where things get messy. Not every executioner was a master craftsman. Some took multiple swings, others missed entirely. Mary, Queen of Scots' execution in 1587 needed 3 attempts before the job was finished. The first blow hit the back of her head, the second nearly severed her neck, and the third finally completed the task. The crowd watched in horror as this quick method turned into a butcher's nightmare. Then there's the weird part about talking heads. Witnesses swore they saw victims' lips moving or eyes blinking after decapitation. Scientists now know the brain can remain conscious for several seconds after losing its body. Pleasant dreams tonight. The spectacle drew massive crowds anyway. Public beheadings became social events where people brought picnic baskets and made bets on how many swings it would take. Yet even this civilized execution method couldn't escape medieval Europe's appetite for creative cruelty. Speaking of creative, England's lawmakers weren't satisfied with just chopping heads. They had an even more disturbing method waiting in their legal arsenal. While most executioners reached for axes or ropes, some creative minds in 16th century England decided cooking people alive was the way to go. Parliament literally passed a law making boiling an official execution method, because apparently regular murder wasn't theatrical enough. The process was exactly what it sounds like. Victims got dunked into massive cauldrons filled with water or oil, then slowly cooked like a medieval soup. The water started cold, then gradually heated up until the person literally boiled to death. Takes about an hour if you're wondering, which you probably weren't, but now you know. England used this charming method primarily for poisoners and murderers. The logic? If you killed someone with poison, you deserved to die by another slow, agonizing method. Medieval justice had a twisted sense of irony. Richard Roos learned this the hard way in 1531. This cook tried poisoning the Bishop of Rochester's dinner guests. Parliament specifically ordered him boiled alive in public. Talk about poetic justice. The crowd gathered in Smithfield to watch a cook get cooked. The executioner built a fire under a massive pot, filled it with water, and slowly brought Rose to a boil. But here's the weird part. Boiling wasn't actually that common, even by medieval standards. Most executioners found it too complicated. You needed specialized equipment, tons of fuel, and perfect timing. Mess up the temperature, and either nothing happens or the victim dies too quickly. Professional executioners had reputations to maintain. The psychological impact was brutal, though. Watching someone slowly cook alive while screaming created lasting trauma for witnesses. That was the point. Authorities wanted people terrified of committing certain crimes. Nothing says don't poison people quite like watching someone boil to death. The method disappeared by the late 1500s. Too messy, too expensive, too time-consuming. But while boiling required elaborate preparation and specialized equipment, other execution methods focused on pure physical destruction of the human body itself. While boiling someone alive sounds horrific, medieval Europe had even more creative ways to make people suffer. Enter flaying, the art of slowly peeling someone's skin off their body while they're still breathing. This wasn't some quick slice and done deal. Professional executioners would start with small cuts, then carefully separate the skin from muscle tissue piece by piece. The victim stayed conscious for most of it. Why? Because losing your skin doesn't kill you immediately. It just hurts more than anything else imaginable. The Byzantine Empire loved this method for dealing with traitors. They'd tie the person down and begin the slow process, sometimes taking hours to complete. Death usually came from shock, blood loss, or infection, but not before the victim experienced every agonizing moment of having their protective layer removed. What made flaying particularly twisted was its psychological impact on witnesses. People could handle seeing someone get their head chopped off quickly, but watching skin get peeled away like you're preparing an orange, that stayed with you forever. Medieval rulers understood this perfectly. They'd often display the flayed skin afterward, stretched out like some grotesque banner. Nothing said, "Don't mess with us," quite like seeing someone's entire epidermis hanging from a castle wall. The Assyrians were probably the most enthusiastic about this practice, though it popped up across different cultures. They'd even flay enemy soldiers and use their skin to cover siege equipment. Talk about adding insult to fatal injury. Here's the really messed up part. Some victims were flayed partially and then released. Imagine surviving that and trying to explain to your family why you look like a horror movie prop. The psychological torture lasted way longer than the physical punishment. But here's what's interesting about medieval justice. Sometimes they combined multiple tortures before the final execution. And speaking of combinations, there was one device that didn't kill you outright, but definitely made you wish it would. While other execution methods aimed to kill quickly, medieval authorities had a different idea brewing in their dungeons. Why rush to the grave when you could spend quality time extracting confessions first? Enter the rack, basically a medieval stretching machine that turned human bodies into reluctant accordions. The concept was brilliantly simple and horrifically effective. Prisoners got tied by their wrists and ankles to opposite ends of a wooden frame. Then operators slowly turned handles, pulling the victim in both directions until joints popped like bubble wrap at a kid's birthday party. The Tower of London became particularly famous for hosting these stretching sessions. Guards didn't even need to apply much pressure initially. Just the sight of the contraption made most people suddenly remember crimes they'd forgotten about. Smart psychology, really. But here's where things get interesting. The rack wasn't technically an execution device. It was designed to keep people alive while extracting maximum information. Skilled operators knew exactly how far to stretch without causing immediate death. They wanted confessions, not corpses. Anne Askew discovered this firsthand in 1546. Religious authorities suspected her of heresy and decided her joints needed loosening. Even after enduring the rack's gentle persuasion, she refused to name other Protestants. Her defiance impressed even her torturers, though it didn't save her from burning later. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect. Those screams echoing from torture chambers weren't accidental byproducts. They were features. Every prisoner waiting their turn got to hear exactly what awaited them. Most cracked before even touching the device. The Spanish Inquisition elevated rack usage to an art form. They developed precise techniques for maximizing pain while minimizing permanent damage. After all, victims still needed to walk to their trials afterward. Professional courtesy demanded it. What made the rack particularly terrifying was its slow, deliberate nature. Unlike swift beheadings or sudden hangings, this method gave victims plenty of time to contemplate their predicament. But even the rack's methodical approach paled in comparison to punishments that abandoned quick deaths entirely for something far more isolating. While most medieval executions involved dramatic public spectacles, some authorities preferred methods that made people simply disappear. Drowning and immurement offered something different, the complete erasure of a person from society. Drowning wasn't just tossing someone into a river and calling it a day. The process usually involved binding the accused's hands and feet, then throwing them into deep water to see if they'd float or sink. During witch trials in Central Europe, this became particularly twisted. If you floated, you were clearly a witch using dark magic, straight to execution. If you sank and drowned, well, congratulations, you were innocent. Dead, but innocent. The logic was absolutely bonkers, but it served its purpose perfectly. Communities could eliminate anyone they found threatening while maintaining the illusion of divine judgment. Then there's immurement, being walled up alive in a small space and left to die slowly. This punishment targeted nuns who broke their vows, monks caught in serious violations, or political traitors who needed to vanish quietly. The process was methodical and cold. Victims were placed in tiny chambers, sometimes with just enough food and water to extend their suffering for days or weeks. What made these methods particularly terrifying wasn't just the death itself, but what happened afterward. Unlike public executions where families could eventually claim bodies, drowning and immurement victims often received no proper burial rites. In medieval society, this spiritual abandonment was considered worse than death itself. The psychological impact on communities was devastating. People understood that certain crimes wouldn't just cost them their lives, they'd lose their souls, their dignity, and any chance of being remembered as human beings. The fear wasn't about dying painfully, but about disappearing entirely from God's grace and human memory. These methods created a special kind of terror that went beyond physical pain. But if you think disappearing forever sounds horrific, wait until you hear about what ancient Persians did with boats and honey. While medieval Europe had plenty of creative ways to kill people, the Persians took torture to an entirely different level with something called Scaphism. The name comes from the Greek word for boat, but don't expect any pleasant sailing trips here. Here's how this nightmare worked. Guards would strip the victim naked and trap them between two small boats or wooden troughs, like a human sandwich, only their head, hands, and feet stuck out. Then came the force feeding, milk and honey poured down their throat until they couldn't take any more. Sounds almost pleasant, right? Well, that's where things got interesting. The honey wasn't just for sweetness. Guards smeared it all over the victim's exposed face and limbs, creating the perfect insect magnet. Then they'd float this human torture device on a stagnant pond and wait. The forced milk and honey caused violent diarrhea, which pooled inside the wooden prison with nowhere to go. But the real horror was just beginning. Flies, wasps, and other insects swarmed to the honey-covered victim. They laid eggs in the waist, in open wounds, anywhere they could find moisture. The bugs literally ate the person alive from the inside out while they remained conscious for days. Death usually took between 17 to 20 days. The victim died from a combination of dehydration, starvation, and sepsis from countless insect bites and infections. Guards kept them alive by continuing the daily force feeding, making sure the process lasted as long as possible. Persian rulers reserved this method for traitors and their worst enemies. Historical records mention it was used on a soldier named Mithridates who killed a royal prince. The whole point was creating maximum suffering over maximum time. Thankfully, Scaphism never caught on in Europe. Maybe even medieval executioners had their limits. But speaking of European creativity, they found other ways to make death linger long after the execution itself was over. Death wasn't always the end of your punishment in medieval times. Sometimes it was just the beginning of your real humiliation. Public gibbeting took execution to the next level of psychological warfare. After hanging someone for highway robbery, piracy, or serious theft, authorities would stuff the rotting corpse into an iron cage called a gibbet. Then they'd hoist it up on a tall post along busy roads where travelers couldn't miss it. The bodies weren't taken down after a few days either. These human scarecrows stayed up for months, sometimes years, until weather and scavengers picked them completely clean. Imagine riding to the next town and seeing 3 or 4 cages swaying in the wind, each containing what used to be someone's son or brother. England perfected this gruesome billboard system, but Germany and parts of France got creative with it too. The cages were custom fitted to each criminal's body, ensuring maximum display value as the corpse slowly fell apart. Birds would nest in the rib cages. Rain would collect in the skulls. But here's the twisted genius behind gibbeting. It attacks something deeper than just fear of death. Everyone back then cared deeply about proper burial and their soul's journey to the afterlife. Having your remains rot publicly in a cage meant spiritual damnation and social disgrace for your entire family. The locations weren't random either. Authorities strategically placed gibbets at crossroads, near town entrances, or along major trade routes where maximum people would witness the decay. Some spots became so famous for their gibbet displays that they kept the name centuries later. Highway robbers particularly hated this fate because they'd often end up displayed exactly where they committed their crimes. Talk about ironic justice. The same stretch of road where you once terrorized merchants becomes your permanent address. The practice gradually died out by the 1800s, but those iron cages left deep psychological scars on entire generations who grew up seeing human remains swinging overhead.